Hello, welcome to Sunday Science Q&A, and today we're doing a special astronaut special with Helen Sharman, which we're really looking forward to. There's one slight, I should tell you, there's a couple of things that have gone slightly wrong initially. One is that my camera's not working, so I've not got the normal kind of high quality, which is good for you actually, because you don't want to see this in high quality. The second slight glitch is that we can't find Helen Sharman, but apart from that, our Helen Sharman special is going extremely well. I do have this pen though from her speakers management, and if you look at that, I don't know if you can see, it's a little torch there. So if we don't have Helen Sharman, I'll just keep showing you this excellent torch-based pen. But we do have Kevin Fong, who I think, as far as I know, the second most listened to science show of 2019 that was on the BBC. I'm not going to say what the first one was. Oh, I'm blushing. Anyway, but it was 30 Minutes to the Moon. There was
scrap.
Yeah, come on. Yeah, but you're right. Fair enough, Kevin. We had 2 more episodes than you. I reckon if that was taken into account. But Kevin Fong's 13 Minutes, the man, it was. I have not spoken to anyone who is not just utter delight of how deeply it went, how beautifully it was made, how many fascinating stories and fascinating voices there were. So we'll be talking about that as well. Quick couple of things to mention. If you can support us via Patreon, that is fantastic. I know a lot of you do support us via Patreon already. We've had a bit of a week off. We did have one episode of Tips for Existence on Wednesday with Adrian Owen, who's a very interesting neuroscientist who's done a lot of work with patients who appear to be in vegetative states. And that was a great conversation with him about consciousness and other things, and very much a kind of practical conversation about consciousness, not that one that gets highly philosophical and leads absolutely nowhere, because there are many of those as well. And I'm very adept at taking people to conversations that lead nowhere. So if you can support us via Patreon, that's fantastic. Send us live questions via live chat, or you can tweet us at Cosmic Shambles. And next week we're changing the time, because we decided, as it got into the summer, and of course all of you in the last week have just spend a lot of time out in the sunshine. You've been really basking in the sunshine, or just basking in trying to watch the Glastonbury Festival and not being able to get through to that as well. There's been a lot of basking, obviously, in the last week. So we're going to move the show to 10 a.m. So Sundays, from now on, Sunday Science Q&A, we thought 10 a.m. might be a better time. We'll try that for a few weeks, and also do give us your feedback. You might consider that middle afternoon's better, but we think when it does get sunny, people won't necessarily have hung around the house all day to hear these conversations. Though I hope you will. You should. That's the way that a cult works, and that's how we see it. We're also joined by Helen Czerski, as usual. Helen, how are you?
I'm doing very well. I have been out in the rain today, so when unexpected showers, the best of British summer weather, where you get a shower where you didn't expect one. So yes, I'm doing very well. And the reason I don't have a This Week in Science this week is because Helen Sharman obviously is our This Week in Science, because I think it was the 18th of May 1991, she launched to join into space, becoming Britain's first astronaut. And it's very, people had to be reminded of that, I think, around the time Tim Peake went up. But she was, even though she didn't fly with the flag. I think Kev probably knows the details better than me. So she is our This Week in Science, even though there's some kind of technical glitch. So we've not quite got her yet, but we will, I'm sure.
Looking back, you should have prepared for this. Very let down by Helen. And Kevin as well. Let's go over to you, because this is I will also mention this. Kevin, of course, is a doctor as well, and we're not going to do any questions about COVID-19. Kevin's done an enormous amount of work in the last year, and I'm sure some of you might be following him on Twitter or seeing some of the different articles that he's been tweeting as well about working in a hospital. We will hopefully do that at some point, but today we are going to keep it to space exploration. So, Kevin, I want to ask you, first of all, though, when does your fascination begin? Because you have such a deep fascination, and you're too young to have been sat at the telly watching, Apollo 11. When does it kick in?
Yeah, so I've always said, the thing that made me pursue a career in science was always space. But of course, it was my parents. But the two are related, because my parents turn up. They know they have to find some way to drive my ambition and my my interest really with education. And they don't really understand how to do that. They themselves don't have that much of an education when they first come to this country. But they know that everyone, this is the 1970s, are just talking about space exploration all the time. And they think this is an idea that's big enough. And that's the thing that really has stayed with me. This is an idea that's big enough for us to talk as a family around the dinner table about it in whatever way you want to. And they dragged me out of bed dragged is probably a reasonable word. It's 1975. They dragged me out of bed Thursday evening. It was lovely. We'd been to the market that day. I had one of those cars where you span the wheels and the sparks went off inside it in the dark. I remember, all of that. And it's the Apollo-Soyuz test project, 1975. Alexei Leonov, Tom Stafford, shaking hands. And of course, I'm 4 years old, so the subtleties of the geopolitics of that were lost on me. But, you're watching these people float down a tunnel, a cramped tunnel, and floating flags back and forth and shaking hands and embracing like they're the best friends of all time. And that stayed with me. And I think to a child growing up, the idea that you can fire people off the face of the planet at 25,000 miles an hour to get to another planetary body meant that anything but anything this life must be possible. So it started there and it's stayed with me ever since.
Do you have, obviously you've since then, looked back at so much footage of other launches. Do you have, I was thinking, I remember talking to Rusty Schweikart about Apollo 17. I think it's Apollo 17 was the only nighttime launch. Is that right? Am I getting that?
You might be right. That I don't know. And I've never seen a nighttime launch, and I really want to, because it's meant to be like an almost religious experience. You watch the night turn to day, and I've seen a few launches, but not that.
Because that's what he said. He was there with a philosopher who kind of looked at astronauts as just being this John Wayne kind of American fantasy. And then this philosopher saw this and, the noise, and to see it as, I can't remember how late at night it was, but he said, everyone was into it. It becomes even more, the resonance of it. So what is your favorite launch?
Well, my favorite launch is actually having been there to watch STS-135, the last shuttle going into space, because it was deeply emotional, because everyone wanted it off the ground, and the weather was really marginal, and no one knew if it was going to go, and it was somewhere between a sort of the usual celebrations that you have around a launch, but it was something sort of quite elegiac about the whole thing, because this was the last mission. So that was wonderful. We were at 2 miles away, and here's the thing about any launch that you go to. It's kind of like this exercise in massive cognitive dissonance, because you're looking at this thing, you're 2 miles from it, you know how big it is, you know how fast it now must be moving, and you think these things can't be true together. It can't be that big and moving that fast and going right now, and it will shortly be in space. And so that launch for me was such a visceral experience, because at 2 miles you see the light and it flashes over, and then you do feel it in your chest. It just comes through your chest and resonates your whole thoracic cavity. So that one for me was the launch, and the last shuttle to go.
It is interesting though how these things come. So I'm a little bit younger than you, and so I never watched the launches as a kid, and I feel that I grew up in an era where it was a thing that was on the news, like rockets went, and it was kind of, they were always there, right? But when it hit me was actually when that shuttle came down, and it was because of something our friend Adam Rutherford did, who I think was working at Nature at the time, and he put together this video where it was a series of shots of a single shuttle flight, but every shot was from a successive launch. So the first shot you see is from the astronauts from the first ever shuttle launch, and then they took that last shot is of that flight landing, and they edited it in that morning and put it out. And it was only when I saw that video, when you see the hairstyles change, you see Challenger, you see these bits along the way, you see how the people change, and how it stays this kind of pure experience of putting humans into space. And actually watching that, which I recommend, it's probably on YouTube somewhere, I highly recommend going to find it, was the first time I really understood the enormity of the Enterprise, because I'd just grown up with shuttles kind of coming and going, which sounds awful now.
But the success of the shuttle was that it almost became the backdrop. It was the item that had in the news shortly before or after the skateboarding duck type item, and the success of it really was, that it formed a bridge really to the future. We talk about the space age and we think about that being Apollo, but the space age for me at least was shuttle, because shuttle was so much of that technology raining down into our lives and changing our lives. So these The shuttle program, I think, was one of those things that you don't really appreciate it when it's there. You appreciate it once it's gone. There is no machine ever built that is as complicated as shuttle was, and we won't see another one for quite a long time. I mean, look at what we've gone back to. As wonderful as all the new vehicles are, the vehicles themselves are nowhere near as complicated as shuttle was, and that was part of its success, and that was part of its downfall, really.
But there's that interesting thing about complexity, isn't there? So I've just read Test Gods, the book about Virgin Galactic, and their mission in space. And the thing that is really striking is this: it's almost two polar opposites. There's the most simple robot-powered thing, and there's the most complicated sort of human, human piloted, but also it's what you get on the way to the simple thing. It's like you have to go through the complexity to get to the simple thing, but people really like the complicated machines, and there's this this respect for test pilots and astronauts in the way that there isn't for a passenger. And it feels, is this a temporary period where we go through this bit where you need this enormous complexity, and then it's going to get really boring and simple because it becomes routine?
Well, I think you're right there. I think when you're pioneer, you do go through this phase where you at least have one thing that looks a little bit like a Rube Goldberg machine, and until people realize what is the optimal complexity for this thing, and I think cars, cars are like that. You look at what happened to them and all the things we did, and you settle down to some fairly basic form, and its form and function together. I think I'm deeply encouraged by what's happening at the moment. I mean, look at it. I mean, look at what's happening with space exploration at the moment. And there was a moment really when shuttle went away that you thought, is this when we fall back to Earth and become slightly less ambitious about everything? Because there definitely was a hiatus where I thought, I don't know if the momentum will continue. And yet look at it, and look at the suite of vehicles and endeavors there are now, not just in human space exploration, but also in remote sensing platforms and probes. Look at what we're putting onto Mars. Look at what's on Mars. Look at the helicopters on Mars. So I think that this period now is sort of that period where we've sort of found, the right level of complexity, and now we're going to be able to use this thing to expand our reach quite dramatically. So this is the most exciting period in space exploration that I can remember for quite some time, and I'm looking forward to charting it over the next few years.
The mentioned, by the way, we still can't get through to Helen. Trent, who is our producer, spoke to her yesterday, and everything was clear. So we don't know quite what's going on. We hope everything is all right with her. We will. She may be joining us later on. Otherwise, Kevin, you got a lot of heavy lifting to do. But this is something I want to do, because some people might know about the fact that one of the episodes of the Infinite Monkey Cage you were on was with Brian Blessed, who called you something which I will now not repeat, because we like the fact that younger people watch this as well, and in fact some quite old people probably wouldn't like what he called you on that particular show. But can you tell us a little bit about what it was like? You went with Brian Blessed to watch him having cosmonaut training. He was in his 60s by then, wasn't he? I think.
Yeah, he was. I mean, Brian is Brian, and I'm not sure there is a version of him that isn't the thing that you see and hear on the radio and the television. I actually hadn't, when they made this series called, I think it was called Ascent of Mars Mountain, this idea that climbers would work out what it would be like to try and climb Mount Olympus. And so they did all sorts of craziness, and they managed to get Brian sort of in a spacesuit on the end of a rope, climbing up bits of rock. And he sort of fancied himself as a bit of a mountaineer. And I know in a different life, you could see him being this sort of heroic mountaineer type as well. So it all suited him down to the ground. But he is a force of nature. We say that, right? We say that as an expression. They're a bit of a force of nature. No, Brian Blessed is a force of nature. He should have a force of nature named after him. I mean, he is unbelievable. And well, I mean, as the episode of the Monkey Cage that he was on attests to, he's there in every moment of his life at full volume, in full force. So, I'm not sure how long you could spend on a space station with him, but
you see, that's an interesting thing about it, because I have to admit, from my limited experience of working with him, which is he does this thing where he puts on the show that he knows people love, but when someone starts talking about, for instance, space exploration, he he drops out of it because he thinks, I want to hear. And that's the thing that I like about him is he puts on a show, but he doesn't then crush everyone out. I mean, it's a weird thing because we talk about that episode and we know what happened in that episode. I think a lot of listeners don't, because I think there was an enormous amount of editing because it goes out too early for that kind of language. But it was, I mean, there was one thing, and I can't remember exactly what it is, that I'm going to give this in such a rough, weird way, but there's some kind of chair, gyroscopic chair, I think, that's involved in training, which really affects through minute movement, seems to affect, is it the middle ear? Can you because that I think was one of the big moments, wasn't it?
It's called the Barani chair, and it's a chair that you use to stimulate the inner ear, really, and the way that it senses acceleration, and it's just a chair with well-oiled bearings that spins. I think they had him in that, and the thing about that chair is, if you know what you're doing, you can make almost anyone feel sick, because you get them to close their eyes, you spin them up, you get them to put their ear on their shoulder. Their brain thinks their body is turning in one plane, whereas actually they're actually turning in a different plane. And then when they open their eyes and tilt their head up and stand up, the world is literally somersaulting, from your perception, is somersaulting head over heels. And he didn't like that very much from recollection. So, I'm not sure that I was actually with him when that was going on, although he blames me for almost all of it. I think I just advised on these experiments. So,
but there's this interesting question, isn't it, about who goes into space, and it's kind of becoming, it's there's basically, at the moment, it was one group, it was proper NASA and Russian, cosmonauts and astronauts, and then there's sort of this new breed which is coming along, which is very rich people. But for everyone else, I think that it seems like at the beginning, and Kev, you would know this much better than me, that you needed a test pilot because you had to fly a thing that no one had ever flown before. And then there's this period where you need people who get on with each other because they're going to be, hanging around in space, and then you need them to be able to do experiments for other people and all that kind of thing. And fundamentally, if you wanted to be, if anyone does work out the radiation problem and humans get to Mars, you need someone you're going to be happy to be in a very confined space with for a very long period of time. Is the type of person, and then you want the poets and the dreamers, like Michael Collins, who died recently, his autobiography is Carrying the Fire, is such a fabulous book because he was a poet and a test pilot. Like, what sort of astronauts do we want in the future?
Much there. The first thing is about selection. So at the start of the space age, no one knew who we wanted to send into space. No one knew who should be a space explorer. And although it seems sort of obvious or given now that test pilots should have been the right phenotype, they did think about almost everything. They thought about deep sea divers, they thought about submariners, they thought about people who did long range industrial jobs, and it came down to the test pilots in the end. But it isn't as straightforward as you think, partly because those systems were built to be completely automated originally, and they didn't think there would be that much of a job for pilots to do. And actually, the book that captures that era of who is an astronaut and what is it to be an astronaut, that captures it more than anything else, is Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff. I mean, a beautiful, beautiful book. But it talks about the ziggurat and who was at the top of the ziggurat and who you had to beat up to get to the top of the pile. And I remember interviewing Walt Cunningham, who was Apollo 7 pilot, and I talked to him. I said, Walt, what was it like being these sort of insanely competitive fighter jocks and everyone wondering who was on the top of the pile? How did you set that aside to fly with them as crews on Apollo? And he turned around and he looked at me and said, who said we set that stuff aside? And that's true, right? So they were competitive till the last day that they were in the astronaut. Well, and even beyond that, I think. And you're right. Then you go into the era of shuttle, and not only does it move out of this sort of basically white chisel-jawed male test pilot phenotype, it moves into, well, now we're going to fly other people. We're going to fly women. We're going to fly scientists. We're going to fly a much broader cross-section of society. And over that 30-year period, you see spaceflight becoming accessible to not the full range of people in the United States, but in a much broader cross-section. NASA tried really hard to have its astronaut corps as representative as it could of the at least the ethnicity and the gender makeup of the United States. And what I love now is, as we go into the future, we're looking at a future in which space might be accessible pretty much to all of us. Now, there'll be a big financial tag with that for a while, but I that's pretty hopeful, right? And that's what you want. That's what you want, a future in which this thing is not just a preserve of a discrete elite. You do want it accessible to all. So I kind of look forward to that. You talked about Michael Collins there, and Michael Collins, I just have to tell you this. He was wonderful when we interviewed him. He was the first interview we did for 30 Minutes to the Moon, and I'll never forget. We pulled up to the car park. It was nighttime. It's in Florida. I get out. There's a good, not quite a full moon, but there's a good chunk of the moon you can see in the sky on the clear night. And you're thinking, tomorrow I am going to be talking to a guy who's been around that thing at close range a few times. And his daughter, Kate, who was lovely, who helped us get the interview, said, sure, come and interview him. He's up for it. If he thinks you're asking bad questions, he'll kick you out of the room.
No pressure.
No pressure. And you roll up and he's there and he greets us, he's waving to us from the door in his Floridian fatigues. He's got a pair of sandals and shorts and a T-shirt. And interviewing him was probably the most terrifying interview I've ever done with anyone, because we were aware that he wouldn't suffer falls, and what that would mean is your long trip ended in a 10-minute interview with you saying, thanks for coming, guys, get out. And I think, well, okay, but once we get going and I've got a bit of a rapport going with him, we'll be fine. It was not like that. It was like being in a dogfight for the whole of the hour and a half we were there. And when I thought he was in front of me and in my sights, and I had him, and I wanted, and I was going to ask him the question, he was behind me and hosing me down. And every question you asked, he delivered this beautiful sort of soliloquy of a reply or nothing at all. And that was really interesting. Because he's a fighter pilot, right? He's not. You ask him, "Are you a fighter pilot or an astronaut?" He's like, there's no question there. He identifies as a pilot beyond everything, and as a fighter pilot, it's a performative thing. So he was going to give me gold or nothing, and that was him in the air thinking, either I'm going to do this incredible looping hypersonic maneuver, or I'm going to do nothing and stay where I am. And so we had a lovely interview, but the full tape of that interview is quite hilarious, because there's some quite awkward moments where you'll put together what you think is a great question and going, I got nothing. I got nothing for you. And you're like, okay, we'll move on. So I was very sad to see him go. You're right in what you say. Of all of the Apollo crews, I think he was the most emotionally intelligent and most emotionally in touch. And afterwards, I came to think, if you had to ask who do you want to be, Armstrong, Aldrin, or Collins, you wanted to be Collins. He was so at ease with himself. He was so happy with his place in that mission and in life. So yeah, he was a great guy.
You must have been terrified, though, that a little in your head would suddenly, the first question would be, so at one point you must have been the loneliest human. Oh my God, I've said it. Oh my. I imagine that's where the show you the door comes from, which is generally, what did it feel like? Or you were the lonely. Those kind of astronaut questions are the ones where you go, make sure you cross those out of your head as early as possible. Just don't let out.
We were pre-warned about were you the loneliest man ever? Because that was definitely your going out the door thing. To the point where it became one of those things, sort of like that thing that ironic processing. You thought you might just blurt it out at one point, and at one point I asked something completely different, and he thought it was that question. He said, "Are you now asking me if I'm the loneliest person in the history of lonely?" I'm like, "No, Michael, I'm." And what actually the interesting thing that he said about that was he hated that question because he said, A, he wasn't alone, because he had, for the most part, there were very brief periods when he was radio silent on that, and B, again, as a fighter pilot, he knew what it was to be in the cockpit of a vehicle on your own with no one talking to you, and he actually quite liked that time. That time is there to be enjoyed. So he as we boxed around it, he ended up saying, look, of course I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. But yeah, I dreaded getting, I just didn't want the ignominy of getting kicked out of an interview with Michael Collins. So we just about got there.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? That we'll get on to audience questions actually in a moment. But we should say Kevin not only is a medical doctor dealing with kind of on planet Earth, who has a great knowledge in terms of the different health situations that might arise during space exploration, and also has done a lot of the training and stuff like that. But that interview thing is, I remember Christopher Sykes, who amongst many things made the series of interviews with Richard Feynman, and he said it was really interesting. One of the first things you learn as an interviewer is don't immediately follow up with another question, because if you leave silence, someone then goes, oh, but, and he said with Feynman, he went, oh no, it doesn't. It literally is, no, I've given you everything there. And so he would leave these spaces and then go, no, next question then, about Los Alamos. Let's start off with a question from Mariella. Hello, Mariella. She's just watched the film Stowaway, which she said apparently is pretty accurate. You can tell us whether that's true, Kevin, or not. And it said the long sequence depicting the launch seems so much more violent than Mariella had imagined. How do you train for that kind of violent shaking?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a couple of things about that. One is I did watch it. It's an okay film. I love it because in it they've got this artificial gravity spaceship, which is the best, I think, depiction of what a real artificial gravity spaceship would look like. I think it's based upon there is a NASA mission reference document that has, so what you would end up having is something that is sort of this counterweight with a vehicle on one side and the whole thing spinning around it, and it's basically the diameter of the London Eye, and that's what they've built. So I liked that. The launch is also pretty accurate because people totally underestimate how for shuttle the launch is violent. I'm told that for Soyuz it's much less so, because Soyuz goes up on liquid rockets and they're a bit smoother. The onset of thrust is a lot gentler. And indeed, my friend Mike Barrett, my good friend, who's also a doctor and an astronaut, sort of says that the only really way you've launched when you're on Soyuz is you watch the mission clock start ticking up. He says, it's kind of gentle. Shuttle was different. Shuttle is really violent. When you see the cockpit cam of that, you got a whole bunch of people going like this, and
your webcam was moving as you did that.
That's always good. It's always good Star Trek special effects there. And so you got these emergency cards with font about this big on them, and they all say you got to memorize that because you can't read it. Your eyeballs are going up and down too much. And that was all about the solids. So the solid rocket boosters have a lot of early, quick onset, violent thrust, and so that's why you should look it up on YouTube or whatever. The cockpit cam of any of those launches that they've got. In fact, the one from STS-135. The crew got such a massive smile on their faces. They're going, but they're really bouncing up and down. So yeah, that stuff is pretty violent. You don't train to deal with it. They build a vehicle that deals with you dealing with it. So you're strapped in and you're not going anywhere. And anything that isn't strapped in and strapped down is going to be all over the place, which you don't want. So it's about the vehicle design rather than your training to deal with it.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Neville was wondering how much has astronaut training changed since the time that Helen would have been training? Because I think she had shorter training than you generally have now, didn't she? I'm not sure. I can't remember.
She had 2 years, did she?
So, and it depends on what. So it depends on what you mean by training. So you get selected as an astronaut, and certainly in the NASA astronaut corps, you then do some general training, which is all about understanding what NASA is, understanding how the human space exploration bit works inside of that, and then general training about the sorts of vehicles that you might be going on. And then you get assigned to mission, and you get mission-specific training, and that can go on for a long time and many, many years, and you train very specifically with your crew so that you gel as a crew, and you can do the things that you're going to have to do on mission. And so those are very different things. The generic bit is basically learn to speak the language and learn these vehicles in a generic sense. For Helen's mission, I think it was very focused. She was going up on a Soyuz, and she's going to Mir, and so there was a lot around that. The way that the training has changed over time is basically nods to the different roles that the crews have. So again, it's mission specific. So the Apollo crews are trained very much like test pilots, because the things they're flying are very much test articles, and the crescendo of the Apollo project, the landing on the moon, is this very, very, I think that last 13 minutes down to the moon is very much like a test pilot operation. You're there with a system that is the very skinny limits of its ability to perform, in which basically bits of it are failing and not quite working the way you want them to, and you have to make a decision about whether you punch out or whether you continue. I think when we move into the era of shuttle, you then have sort of two different training streams. They selected, and NASA selected sort of pilot astronauts separately from the mission specialists. And the mission specialists were sort of in many ways, the sort of the backseat science teams. They did take part in the mission as mission engineers as well, but they had a slightly different training overall. They weren't expected to fly the vehicle. They were expected to be able to maintain it and prosecute the science. And as we go forwards into the future, I think increasingly you're going to see this move towards astronaut crews becoming more and more, as the vehicles become more capable, more reliable, and more automated. You're going to begin to get a cadre of astronauts who are much more like the British Antarctic Survey types, who are very brilliantly trained, but actually delivering there is not routine, because spaceflight can never be routine, just simply because of the energies involved. But it will become more, less immediately life-threatening, and you'll have these people who are trained to be scientists in a particular environment. And I think that's the model for the future. I think that's the way it will change. The type of person has changed more than anything else, I think. As you rightly say, you want not people who are individuals who are great at individual performance over short sprints of time, but rather people who can live in an environment and get on and work together for long periods of time, because the cooperation, the cohesion between your crew is the sole determinant is one of the principal determinants of mission success. So I think it's a move away from individualism and towards teamwork.
What's the reason now? So one of the things, I guess, is who's flying the object, right? So on the International Space Station at the moment, presumably it's making orbital adjustments a little bit. It might go up or down in orbit. It might adjust its solar panels. Is any of that done from the ISS itself, or is it controlled from the ground? And like, how much are the astronauts up in the sky actually doing things to keep the ISS on track?
Yeah, so that's a really fascinating question, isn't it? Because let's go back to Apollo again. You look at mission control, and the thing that your mind is tricked into thinking when you look at it is that this is a room full of computers and people in front of computers, but those things are not computers. Those things are cathode ray tube screens that show data and some telephones with rotary dial telephone things on it. So when I spoke to the flight controllers, they said, well, look, we didn't fly the vehicle. We monitored it, and then we told the astronauts what adjustments they needed to make, or gave them advice about the adjustments they might make. I was very lucky. I managed to embed with a flight control team who are in simulation, an International Space Station flight control team. Now, they very really do fly the space station. They're there flicking switches and boosting orbits and all the rest of it. And so they have got remote control of a lot of the things. And space station takes a lot of effort to keep up there. You think it's just up there and floating, but its orbit's always decaying. It needs to boost the orbit. It's got a whole bunch of kit on board that stops it spinning out of control. It's got these 4 huge gyroscopes to stop it doing that. But the astronauts on board are the sort of on the shop floor sort of complex monitoring system and complex intervention system. And so they do need to be tooled up to be able to both repair, adjust, and do essential maintenance on the vehicle so that it can keep flying. So are the astronauts flying it? Well, yes and no, but and they have access to some of that control, but they don't do it alone. They're heavily backed up by flight control room.
I should tell you now that we think it was actually a technical issue. We should never have sent Helen all the way to the pyramid stage of Glastonbury to try and broadcast to us, but she with luck, is going to join us in about 5 minutes' time. Quick question for you, Helen, which is this from Eileen, would like to know if you could take a bubbles experiment onto the ISS or even on the zero-G flights like you did with Shambles, what would you like to do? And you can make it quick.
I actually didn't hear that question because Helen has just joined us, and I was too busy being excited that she joined us.
You still get so excited about seeing an astronaut that you actually go deaf. It's a remarkable thing that happens, isn't it? Well, we'll come back to your bubble experiment later on because we can always ask you that next week, whereas Helen isn't with us next week. Hello, Helen. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, I am so sorry. I thought I was joining you for 4 o'clock, so I thought, oh, I'm in plenty of time. I'm going to log on at about 3:30. My laptop just taken almost 10 minutes to update, and I'm getting all of these. Oh my goodness, where are you? So I am so sorry, but here I am.
Don't worry, we're going to see if you can now do. We've got 50 questions. We've got 19 minutes. I'm sure it's absolutely fine. We'll be able to get through them all. We'll be able to get through them all. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for joining us. Where should we start? This is from Lisa. Lisa would not like to know. Lisa would not like to know. Did Britain's first astronaut mean anything to you during your mission, or were you so focused on the job at hand?
I think yes, it meant something because a lot of what I was doing, even during my training, was because I was British. So we were little celebrities in the Soviet Union. So if there was a big training meeting somewhere, then of course it would be me who had to go and make a speech rather than one of the many Russian trainees. So I kind of was aware then. But actually, when it came to launch day, I was keen, of course, everybody wants to do a good job, but I really didn't want to mess up for the British side. I didn't want it that the British astronaut, caused the mission to go wrong, let's say. So yeah, I think it definitely meant something, and I wanted to make sure I did a really good job, partly because of being British, I think, yes. Now, and I was representing Britain too, of course, it felt an important thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it was. Looking, I can't believe it is 30 years ago because I remember so much that just what remarkable sense that was to actually feel that Britain was now somehow actually, really tangibly involved in going into space. This is very important for perhaps a lot of people listening. With the European Space Agency applications currently opening or currently open, what would you say is your best bit of advice for how to try and get through?
I think, of course, you've got to have all the basic criteria that they say, but there will be many who have that. I think what they're really going to be looking for are people who work well in different types of teams. So are you the type of person who always wants to lead or never voice your concerns, right? Of course not. You need to be that kind of middle kind of person who's easy to get on with, tolerant of other people. You put forward your ideas, but your ideas don't always have to hold sway. You're happy to take consensus. So it's just being a regular kind of team worker. But I think you'd be amazed how many people, if they've not worked in teams, especially if they've not worked in teams in sort of fairly high pressure situations. I can see Kevin nodding here. I think that must be a big thing in A&E and sort of emergency medicine, mustn't it? But it's not me to ask, Robin. That's for you to ask the question.
This is a question from Jordan. This is an I think we talked about this a bit on the last Infinite Monkey Cage, actually, which was about, though we can test the physical capabilities of someone, have you had any thoughts about how we test the mental impact on something like the crewed trip to Mars, which of course is many people's great worry, is how can a human being deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we'll ever really know, will we, until we've got humans out there. But there have been people in isolation. I mean, obviously, it's not on their own. They'll be part of a crew, but they've been in teams of people in isolation. There was that Mars 500 project, wasn't it? So people were away for 500 days to be a kind of Mars mission time. And we've had people go to, other outposts. If you've been on training missions in various parts of the world, or missions on, if you like, for your operation, for your company, the Antarctica, for instance, although that's quite a big team of people there. So we do know what it's like to be isolated, but never to be that far away from Earth, never to have your signals take so long potentially to get back to the support on Earth and then from Earth back up to you. I mean, it could be over 20 minutes when Mars is at its most distant. So I think, yes, it's going to be quite a different kind of crew. We're going to need a very multi-skilled crew, but also people who can double up on skills, because if one person is, for whatever reason, unable to do what they're supposed to do, somebody else is going to have to be able to take over. So yeah, a very big sort of give and take flexibility of a crew, and that isolation is going to be something I think we'll all be asking them about when they get back.
Well, that's interesting actually, because it's something that because I go to sea and it's a weird environment. You come home and everyone talks about what it's like to go away. Nobody ever talks about how weird it is to come home, and that's actually far harder. In my experience, the far harder transition is to come back to society and go, oh, isn't it weird?
I think when I was living in Russia in the Soviet Union, my training, I was, if you like, very cut off from the UK. It was before internet, so there were no emails. We had no telephone to make a call back to the UK unless I used a Russian landline that I had to book 4 or 5 days in advance. It was ridiculous, really. And I would come back on occasion. I'd fly back to London, meet with the mission managers, and I'd see adverts that I hadn't seen before. There were jokes going around about things that had happened in the news that I didn't understand. So it was all that aspect of isolation, I think, as well as the fact that you've physically not been around other people so much, people like you. So this crew and Mars are going to be very, very tight. But you're right, I think you're coming back, it's a bit more of the anticlimax in some respects. Although I think because there'll be so much clamour for hearing about their experiences, perhaps they won't feel it. When you're an astronaut, I think everybody assumes that you land on the surface of the Earth and then everybody goes, well, that's it then, isn't it? But of course, you get all of that debriefing and it does go on for weeks and months afterwards sometimes. So yeah, I think the Mars crew won't have that anticlimax. Is that what you're thinking, Helen, about the kind of...
Well, so it's actually what it's a much smaller type of experience, but you sort of look at society from the outside and it's really odd. There's all these things that we do that are just weird. And because you've been in such close contact with such a small number of people and so completely in tune with so many people, the small group of people for so long, and you arrive back and people sort of don't talk to you and they talk about the wrong things. And then these lumps of metal that everyone carries around. And you can't do anything unless you go through your lump of metal. And no one's really interested in you. And yeah, which sounds really stupid, but when you're on these expeditions, you're kind of checking in with people all the time, right? And it's those, and you sort of re-examine society. It's just like you take away and you go, oh, why do people do this like this? And it's just interesting as a shock. And maybe you're right that because once you come back from an astronaut, being in space, you're guided through. You're not the only one and all of that. Whereas we're just chucked out. You arrive at Gatwick Airport and they go, oh, off you go. And you go, oh, I don't fit here anymore. It was nice on the ship. So yeah.
Yeah, I found that after Brian's luxury tours, when I do a tour with Brian and then, at Heathrow we say goodbye and then it's back to normality as he's picked up, by his Sherpa and carried back to his house. I wanted to ask Helen actually, which is, we've talked about this before, but it really interests me that your values changed a great deal, didn't they? Or certainly things were brought to life, weren't they, by that experience? And not just the experience of going into space. Is that fair to say? Yeah,
absolutely. So it was living in Russia at that time, end of the Cold War, and people there, even in Moscow, which was, if you like, the most... the place where they had the most stuff, most things were more easily available than the rest of the country. But even in Moscow, it was really tough, a tough time for most citizens. Food was in short supply, which is why they had all the queues. You couldn't buy clothes, shoes for love nor money. They just weren't there in the shops. The shops were open, but they were empty. It was very, very difficult. And I think it was being amongst the type of people who therefore didn't think about their material items as being very important, but they would come to my flat or they would phone me up or whatever, and they'd say, how are you? And I'd say, oh, fine, thank you. How are you? And they said, oh, no. I mean, tell me, how are you? And they really wanted to know how I was. And there was a kind of a culture there. Now, whether that was because they hadn't had stuff or whether that was because that's just the way the Russians were, I don't know. But when I was in space, of course, looking back on the Earth, what you miss are the people there. You don't miss your material items, there's all the stuff that we clamour so much to, we strive to populate our houses with, don't we? With our clothes or whatever it is. It's almost like an extension of our personality. We're kind of showing off to the world partly, and I don't know how much of it is for us, how much of it. Yes, I think there's a lot of that, and so I made a point after my space mission that people, individuals as well as people en masse, but people were going to be and always be the most important thing in my life.
Neil's got a question. Neil would like to know, what is the experiment you would most like to have done in space? So if you could take one experiment up now, what's the one you really enjoy doing?
Well, yeah, so I've got, my experiments were all Soviet space mission experiments, because that was part of the deal that the British side had made with them. It was, if you like, part of our payment to get me into space. So I did Soviet experiments. So it would have been nice to have done many, for all of the British ones, of course. I did a few, but very, very few, but those that basically didn't really cost anything to do. There was one I do remember, because I hadn't been involved with many of them, because they were still being developed until the New Deal was made with the Soviets. But there was one, and it was to do with body fluid shift, and it was to do with measuring the impedance, so how, if you like, electrically conductive or not different parts of your body are. And so they were looking at the body fluid shift in space by this, and part of this meant I was going to have to wear this huge elastic strap all around my chest and back with different sort of electrical connections on it, and the strap had been initially designed with a very kind of elastoplast, like very, very sticky kind of gluey stuff on the back of this completely impervious, non-breathable material, and because it was just a sort of a developmental part of the experiment. And they gave this to me during one of my times over in the UK, and I took it back. I didn't have time to test it out then. They said, we want you to wear it for 48 hours, right? And just in test, tell us how it feels, stretch around in it, you know, is it stretchy enough? So I put it on and I could stretch in it, and that bit was fine. But after a while I started to think, you know, it's a bit itchy. and I took it off after 48 hours and I was bright red, right? There's this huge band. So clearly that bit was having to be redesigned, either the sticky stuff or how breathable it was or whatever. But of course, I got a whole load of ribbing when I went into the swimming pool. I was wearing a swimming costume, but the back was quite low, so you could see this great big bright red band. So, of course, I had to explain what was going on to my trainer and all the other astronauts in the swimming pool, so it was a bit embarrassing. So I think partly because of that, I feel I've invested my, I have given pain for this experiment, so I'd quite like to take that one into space and do that one again. I think they've done similar ones subsequently, so that would never actually be done now. But yeah, that would have been the one, I think, partly because I was partway there with it.
Phoebe has got a very specific chocolate question for you, saying, as you had worked for Mars Confectionery, how does the quality of astronaut chocolate stack up to Mars-based Earth chocolate? Well,
we actually have some chocolate in space. I wasn't aware that there was going to be any, and Sergei, my engineer, came over one day and said, look, I found this bit of chocolate in the food, let's share it. And that'd be fantastic, some chocolate. And so there was also these little kind of portions, so we took one each, and we sort of simultaneously popped it into our mouths. But it was the kind of chocolate that you'd normally get, when you go into a really hot country, and there's chocolate that can be developed with a very high melting point. Because clearly, if you're in the middle of, I don't know, sort of Africa or Saudi Arabia or something, your Mars bar is going to get a bit sort of soggy, isn't it? So that there's chocolate normally melts at body heat 37 degrees, would melt often in these hot countries. So it can be developed with a different kind of crystal structure and fats in there that give it a higher melting point. And that's what this space chocolate was. I mean, clearly they didn't want it to melt, but to me that wasn't chocolate. It was like some sort of cocoa flavored fat, which wasn't half as exciting as I was expecting. So I graciously let everybody else have the rest of the chocolate while I was in space.
Now this is Christopher has got, this is from this week's news, and this is for everyone actually. I'll start with you, Kevin, which is Christopher wants to know your thoughts on the UFO report headed to Congress this week. It's all going to be a lot of nothing, isn't it, says Christopher. So this is something that's come up. I mean, if you look at the history of UFOs and the history of Congress, you'll see that really since the first, those early sightings, it's always cropped up. There's always been a few senators who've been kind of overly fascinated, perhaps one could politely say.
Yeah, look, I mean, do pilots up in the dark see stuff that they can't explain very easily? For sure. I'm sure that happens. Does that definitely mean that aliens have been visiting us with some sort of physics-defying vehicles that cross interplanetary space? I still find it hard to get that rationally through my head. Everything that you have to defy for that to happen, when you really look at what has to happen, for them to cross those vast distances. I mean, there are more things in heaven and earth than my philosophy, but I think weird things that pilots see in the dark that they can't explain don't necessarily go and become, E.T. shaking your hand. You know, I don't have access to Area 51 or the files. Helen might. I don't.
So, Helen, what do you feel about this story?
Access to these files either, Kevin. What would I? There is clearly, like Kevin says, there are clearly unidentified things around, right? But just because they're unidentified and they're flying and they're objects doesn't mean to say that they're kind of they've got intelligent life that's designed them or sent them. But we have to keep an open mind. It'd be exciting to find intelligent life. It's one of the reasons why we're sending all these rovers to Mars, is to look for at least evidence of some form of life, even if it's not intelligent. That would still make us go wild. Oh, it's a microbe. We'd be really excited. But yes, I don't get it either. We haven't had. There's not enough evidence. There's not people. There's just too much of this that's not quite evidential enough. It doesn't stack up with me either, I'm afraid.
But if you really wanted a genuine unidentified flying object, you just go to the Amazon and look for a type of fly that no one's given a name to yet, right? I think Chris Lintop, he told me once he pitched a book that was called Why Aliens Don't Exist, and no publisher would take it, but one of them returned it to him with so there was a title, Why Aliens Don't Exist, and the publisher had written underneath, but we really wish they did. And that's it. That is everything. Yeah. That is like the scientists saying this is why they're not there, and everyone else, but wouldn't it be nice? And that's the problem, is it's such a great mental game to play. I think people are never going to stop playing it. But
no, we want that. The philosophy is lovely, isn't it? To actually to think about what would we do if we met somebody. I mean, the Russians, of course, all think that these aliens come down to Earth and they talk to them in Russian, whereas we think they talk to us in English. So there's a kind of a bit of a weird thing in that. But then, of course, there'll be people who really believe that those aliens are real would say, but they're just making you think things. So of course you'd think in your own language. There's always an excuse for something, as I was getting to the Mir space station, it was all a bit tense because we were doing a manual docking. So there was a lot of people who were gathering in mission control, more than usual, a lot more journalists as well. And out of the window, through one of the remote cameras, they could see a UFO, right? It was a little cylindrical item. Now, probably we all reckon it was a bit of rubbish that they'd actually chucked out of the space station naughtily. They shouldn't have done it because they'd done it not long before docking. You should never do anything like that because it could happen in the same orbit and you could hit it. Fortunately, it was going at around about the same speed as us, of course, in the same direction. So it wasn't going to cause any harm, but there was this little cylinder. And of course, the first thing I get when I came back was, Helen, tell us about the NLO, because it's NLO in Russian, whereas it's sort of UFO in English. Tell us about this NLO. What did it say anything? What did you see? Did it flash? And that was, I would say 50% of all my questions from the Russians were about the little cylinder of rubbish.
It's fascinating, as you said, it's the leap, isn't it? Which is definitely there are unidentified flying objects. And that in no way means that they're going to be extraterrestrials in there. And you think of Loch Ness Monster and all of those things, it only takes a couple of bits of footage. And then the moment someone says, I don't believe that they're alien spacecraft, somebody goes, what, are you saying there's no life in the rest of the universe? And you go, well, no, hang on, that again, these are leaps. These are, but it's always interesting. The religious side of it, I think, is very interesting. I've spoken to people where the whole UFO artifact almost now replaced what previously in the Catholic Church would have been the religious artifacts. It's kind of, but let's not talk about Carl Jung yet. This is Spiral Cure would like to know, Helen, what do you think of the concept of short hop space travel between places on Earth?
Oh, now this is exciting, I think, because of course Virgin's just very, very recently done its sort of hop to space and back. So this is really what we could be using kind of suborbital missions for, and making it much less polluting on Earth potentially, and getting us around the Earth much more quickly, if indeed we're physically going to be travelling around the Earth anytime soon. But hopefully we will eventually again, and we'll be able to do it in a slightly more green way. So yeah, I think this is something that's quite feasible and would really help us, to get around quickly. So yeah, and be quite an exciting thing as well. You might get a bit of feeling weightless on your way back down. That'd be good, wouldn't it?
This is a question for you, Kevin, from Samuel. Do you think you'd make the cut for being an astronaut, given what you saw during the show you did with Chris Hadfield about? What was it called? So you want to be an astronaut?
Yeah. It was It was called Astronauts. Do you have what it takes? I think so. I've been in. I applied in 2007. Tim did slightly better than me, and there's a last selection up at the moment. As many of you will know, you have to be under 50 to apply, and I am only just under 50, and so I'm going to find out. So I'll give it. And I'm going to apply, and I'm going to apply not with any hope or expectation, but for me, I mean, I told you at the start of this, my journey, my career, my interest in science was my parents driving me using the vehicle of space exploration to drive my interest and ambition. And so for me, it feels like a very nice full stop, actually. So, yeah, that there are a lot of things that make you selectable as an astronaut, and some of them are in your control and some of them aren't. And who knows? I think that whole process, well, Helen's been through it successfully, but anyone who goes out and thinks, yeah, sure, I could be an astronaut, probably shouldn't be an astronaut, and and probably has no business being out there with that. So do I think I could get through astronaut selection? Gosh, I don't know. There are a lot of people lining up there, and a lot of people out there. So the answer is I don't know, but I'm probably going to find out.
Well, I'd just like to say, Kevin's done an enormous amount of work in the last year, which has helped a huge number of people during the pandemic, and he deserves a treat. Okay, so I think it should be him.
Thank you, Robert. You'll be my reference, of course.
I think I should be. I tell you, I'm the person who definitely knows I would be no good in space. There's so many, the worst on so many different levels. You saw me trying to find my cables before the show today. I mean, that level of fury in a small space would be disastrous. This is a question from, where should we go next? We've got still lots of questions to get through. This is a question from Cody, Helen, which is, what were you least prepared for when you started training?
Whoa, when I started training, I think I wasn't prepared for life on a military base in the Soviet Union. I wasn't prepared for learning to speak Russian, right? So neither of those things. And that was where we began. After that, I became more and more prepared, so it was probably easier. But yeah, that the business about sort of living a completely different life in a different language was very, very weird.
And then in terms of the actual, in the physical training, was there anything were there any moments where you thought, I was not expecting this? Or once you got into it, did the rhythm kind of kick in? You think, right, I know where I'm going to and I know what the destination is.
Yeah, I mean, physically, it's I never found it a big deal. I mean, I was quite young, so I'm probably reasonably strong, but you can, if you're healthy, I think the theory was, Kevin can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if you're healthy, you can pretty much train yourself to a type of fitness. Obviously, you don't need to be able to, although it's fun to run marathons in space, you don't need to be able to run marathons on Earth to be thought of as fit. You need to be healthy, you need to be strong. There was a lot of strength training, actually, so working inside the spacesuit is quite physically demanding, but I'd done sort of weights and so on in the gym during my training, less so beforehand, but that was just all part of the 18 months of prep that we had, and then sort of just generally keeping that cardio fitness going, but I think it's more of a mental health state as well. Once you've got many people who are strong enough and with the stamina enough, it's that mental stamina to keep going through times that are perhaps tough in the training, times when you wonder why you're bothering doing it, because, well, somebody else, even though you're doing the training, somebody else will probably get to fly, not you. You'll end up being the backup, or if it all happens at all. So yeah, there's a lot of doubt always. So I think it's that mental toughness as well. But I think, like Helen was saying, not to be the person who's so tough that they think everything's just going to be so easy for me. It's just, yeah, I'll just be like I can walk on water kind of thing. So Kevin, I'm sure you'll be great. Absolutely. And it won't be a full stop in your life. You said it will be, after all your parents, it will be a full stop. It will be a semicolon, because it will lead to all sorts of other things, I'm sure.
I like that. I'll take it as a semicolon.
Now, Launier's got a question, which is, apart from you going into space, Kevin, this is for everyone. What do the panel think is going to be the next big thing in space travel, human or robotic, over the next 2 decades? So, Kevin, start with you.
Well, do you know, I've been watching Perseverance on Mars at the moment, and I am just amazed the confidence with which JPL puts stuff onto Mars now. You know, when you look at the record of Martian exploration in the last decade of the 20th century, it was so hit and miss. And now they're just chucking this stuff on and it's rolling around. So flying a helicopter on Mars is the thing, because if you look at the ground that those rovers cover per unit time, it's not very far, really, for what you want for a big planet. And so being able to get probes up that have the capacity to fly distances and photograph distances, that for me is something I want to see. I want to see us, you know, up there with drones up, flying around canyons. I mean, how beautiful will that be? How wonderful will it be to explore like that? So for me, as someone who spends a bit of time flying around in helicopters these days, that's what I want to see, and I'm really excited to see what ingenuity the helicopter that's flying around Mars at the minute, or at least that they had flying around Mars, what becomes of that.
Helen.
Yeah, there'll be people waving at that helicopter. So I think that'll be perhaps won't be that helicopter. It won't live that long, but yes, I think certainly 20 years there'll be people up there, but also people elsewhere. So in terms of human exploration, I can see we'll aim for Mars, possibly via the Moon, but within 20 years we'll also be very close, if not on an asteroid, because that's the other thing is we're thinking about how can we use an asteroid? In fact, I was chatting to some astronauts on Friday afternoon, and we were thinking about how, because asteroids, of course, are so tiny, you get the G, you know, the gravity of pull of an asteroid is minuscule. It's like 10 to the minus 5 G that we get on Earth. So could a human being actually stand on an asteroid? And you get all these artist pictures of people standing on an asteroid and sort of mining bits and taking stuff back to their spacecraft. Well, it's unlikely people will stand technology to allow humans to be kind of on, let's say, on the. I can see that being the other thing as well. And one more thing, if I may, just in terms of non-human stuff, we might need humans to sort of to get it up there, but I'd like to see us utilizing energy. I'm sure there must be a way of us harnessing a load of solar energy and perhaps microwaving it, maybe to Earth, so we can use that here. Now, we'd obviously have to make sure that we didn't then use that energy and heat up the planet with that energy, but at least we're not burning fossil fuels to create energy.
I actually interviewed weeks ago who is on that track, although I think there's a lot of bandwidth, but on the question of 20 years time, as the least space person here, but as an Earth scientist, I think it would be an enormous shame if the overall consequence wasn't that we appreciated our own planet better, because there's this kind of feeling that we have to go somewhere else, and we're a small planet in the middle of a very big solar system, and yes, there are planets and asteroids, but there aren't that many, and they're all quite rocky, and they're not nearly as nice as a rainforest on Earth. And I think that if the once low Earth orbit flights open up a bit, once there's more, perhaps you can there'll be, in a few years, you'll be able to direct your own camera, so there'll be a satellite going around and you can have a little joystick to point the camera at things that you want to see. If there isn't, like, the big story of the solar system is our own planet and how fantastic it is and how complex it is and how amazing it is, and we're not looking after it well enough. And I think I'm hoping that space that's great, that's lovely, but there's no point going out there if we don't value what we've got back here, because this is the most alive, complex, varied environment in the solar system. And so and there's this careful balance in how we keep it going. So I think we need a really big shift in how vulnerable we are. That thing about Carl Sagan and the pale blue dot, everyone's sort of forgotten, I think, in the decades since then, since he said that. Everyone you've ever known, everybody who ever lived is on that dot. And I think we need to remember that what we've got is really precious, and we need to do a better job of treating ourselves as part of the system, part of this amazing system, and looking after it. So yeah, go back to space, but look back at the Earth. Go up to space, but look back at the Earth.
But that is interesting, because that might be the big lesson. Should we get to Mars and find out that the idea of terraforming, and even the smallest amount of it, is far more difficult than we'd imagined, then you go back, oh, we're not able just to go to planet B then.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you're
Matt
right.
Damon could barely grow a potato, right? So what?
This is a very simple question for you now, Kev, which is, did you get to meet Hans Zimmer when you were doing 13 Minutes to the Moon?
Do you know what? I did meet him, and it was wonderful, actually. I loved making that podcast series. It was just a joy. It was a labor of love to make. But the process of sitting down with Hans Zimmer and his team and saying, how do you want this music to go, is actually quite an interactive thing. He doesn't just bung you a cassette and go, there you go, there's the soundtrack. And so we had him and his team on the phone and did some Skype chats with him, but then I met him after it had all been made and he's got this sort of wonderful apartment in London where he's got all of these beautiful sort of music bits and pieces, a Moog modular in the corner and everything. So yeah, he was wonderful, and he loves the whole adventure and the romanticism of space as well. So we got on well, I think.
Brilliant. And you, Helen, which is Alan just wants to know, do you want to go up into space again?
Yes, in a word.
I thought you knew what that answer might be. Thank you. So, Helen, have you got, because I know you've been doing lots of events, have you got anything coming up soon that people might want to make sure that they see or try and get a ticket for, if those kind of things are going on?
Yeah, so I'm hopefully going to be at an event in Farnborough, at a sort of space exhibition event in Farnborough, beginning of July time. But I've just started a podcast myself, actually. So it's called Zero Pressure. So we're talking about things that science and technology that affect really things like global issues. How can science and technology help to create sort of a positive effect on sort of social, environmental aspects that do affect the whole world? And so with different guests, and it's sort of it's already out. So it's called Zero Pressure. Just check it out on podcasts. Brilliant.
We'll make sure we tweet that and put it up on the website. Kev, is there anything people should be looking out for from you?
Do you know what? I'm just coming out of my year of just being fully immersed in COVID-19. So I'm kind of looking around me, and I'll say this. So I was just something that Helen said earlier on is Alan Bean I had dinner with once, and he talked about coming back from space, and he said the first thing he did when he was free of all the duties is he'd just come back from the moon, and he said he went to the shopping mall, he bought himself an ice cream, and he sat down and he watched people just walking around and going about their business, and that was wonderful. And so I really related to what Helen was saying there, but that's kind of how I feel at the moment about coming out of the back of where we've been so far with COVID. So there'll be stuff. I haven't quite worked out what it is yet.
Okay, so let's just say you're to have an ice cream. That's excellent. Can I ask? I know I should, but just because we are coming out of everything at the moment, have you got any advice you'd like to give people? Because of course some people do feel, oh right, it's kind of over now. But what would you say in terms of us as we start to get back to what appears to be some normality? What advice would you give to people?
Yeah, look, it's been so difficult, hasn't it? And things clearly are better than they were at the start of this year. We are not out of the woods. You know, all the winter, we were in the woods and the woods were on fire. The woods aren't on fire anymore, but we're not out. And we need to be vigilant, and we need to listen to the advice that we're given, and we need to be guided by the right experts and the right science. And things may change. And if they do, then we will have to listen carefully to that. There's an overwhelming need for all of us to sort of get back what we had before it. But, you know, the best way for us to getting back to our normal lives as fast as possible is to listen to the advice we're given, and if things change, we are going to have to take a step back. So look, it's good at the moment. Don't go crazy. Listen carefully. Don't throw all caution to the wind. There is still a bit of threat out there.
Thank you, Kevin. Coming up.
The podcasts Ocean Matters and Intelligence Squared, all podcasts are very popular at the moment. So the Intelligence Squared, actually, I did just interview Nicholas Schmidl, who was embedded with Virgin Galactic. So if anyone is interested in how the future of spaceflight is panning out, that will be on the Intelligence Squared website soon. And the book Test Gods it's really interesting. It asks a lot of questions, and it's that none of them have been answered yet, but it's really interesting in terms of how and who gets to go to space. So there's that coming up. And other than that, things over the summer, but lots of little things big to mention.
Okay, well, we'll catch up again next week. Anyway, as I said, next week we're going to be at 10 a.m. In the morning. I'm going to be at Trowbridge Town Hall doing a socially distanced gig next Saturday, gig. I did a socially distanced gig at Walthamstow Trades Hall on Thursday, and it was all very well managed. But I'm going to be coming down to Trowbridge. I should also mention Brian Cox and I are doing some warm-up gigs that have just been announced in September in places like Dunstable and Exeter and St Albans. So go and look at Brian's site, the Horizons Tour. Loads more stuff coming up now because Trent's had his holidays, not another one probably this decade, I reckon. So we've got loads more shows coming this week, more Tips for Existence, more book Shambles, and don't forget we've also done Silent Running special of Uncanny Hour is out with Stuart Lee and Mark Kermode and Gemma Arrowsmith and lots of others. Have a lovely rest of the weekend. Look, it's sunny now. Well, it is where I am, of course. That's geographically specific, I suppose. Sorry, it may not be where you are. I was never much of a meteorologist. Thanks, Trent. Bye.